pick up the story in Esther that we've been looking at, other than last week when we had a welcome break for me. And so we want to pick up, and we are in, I believe we're in Esther chapter, I think we were still finishing up Esther chapter 3 last or 2 weeks ago. We had been introduced to our villain of the story, Haman, and to his hatred for the Jewish people. And I think I'm going to move my microphone down. I'm coming out a little too strong here. Let's see if that's a little better. Okay. We were introduced to him and to his hatred toward the Jewish people, specifically because of Mordecai, and the fact that Mordecai, the Jew, would not bow down to Haman, would not treat him with the deference that he expected and thought he deserved. And we've had some kind of an interesting discussion about whether that might or might not be legal in the case of Mordecai, because while the Persians were ordered by their king to bow down to Haman, the Persians also tended to be respectful of other religions that were part of their empire and tried to work with those peoples. And so if the Jews were known to be to not bow down, then they might very well have had an exemption, which might have particularly infuriated Haman, because he's not going to get the respect and there's nothing he can do about it. So Haman hatches a plot. What's Haman's plot? You didn't know I was going to ask you a question this early on, did you?
Kill all the Jews.
Okay, kill all the Jews. No, he's not personally going to do it. What's he going to do to make it happen?
He's going to have someone do it.
Okay, he's going to have someone do it. That was pretty much the other alternative besides doing it himself, so good work there. Can you kind of narrow down, or let's explain a little what the plot is. Anybody remember?
Get the king to declare a decree against the Jews.
Okay. So he gets the king to declare a decree, and one of the things that I think we kind of see in the king is there's a degree to which this king is intellectually lazy, I guess is maybe the nicest way to say it. It seems like he's somewhat impetuous. Now, he's smart enough to know that he's impetuous, and so he has advisors and stuff like that, but he does tend to be a little bit impetuous, and that couples with not necessarily being particularly eager to go educate himself, necessarily. So when he's left to his own, to come up with his own answers and to his own responses, rather than working with his advisors, it seems like he kind of tends towards just saying, okay, whatever, you know, or if something upsets him, then he reacts strongly. We'll see that a little later on. So you kind of get the sense of someone who maybe doesn't, is maybe not a real deep thinker, and is smart enough to know he's not a deep thinker, which is why he consults with his wise men on a regular basis. But when he doesn't have them around, maybe he makes some bad choices, because without really actually questioning Haman as to what this thing, who he's wanting to kill and all the different aspects of this, he just kind of signs off on it, And so the king, we finished in verse 11, where the king says to Haman, that silver is yours because Haman's going to fund this whole process, and the people also to do with them as you please. And so he just kind of hands it over to him. Okay, can I get somebody to read verses 12 through, I guess, the end of the chapter, because it's kind of one long paragraph.
Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict according to all that Haman commanded was written to the king's satraps and to the governors over all the provinces, and to the officials of all the peoples, to every province in its own script and every people in its own language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by the order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel, and the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion.
Okay, so here we see the process by which a royal decree is sent out. And it's not a particularly simple process, because this is a massive empire. And you can't just, pick up your phone and send out a mass text to everybody all at once, or, set up a phone tree or something like that. You have to make sure a physical copy of this goes to each section of the empire, to the leadership there, that it's disseminated properly. So one of the things that we notice, or hopefully we've noticed, is the time frame. What's the time between when the edict is issued and when the edict is supposed to be carried out? Anybody notice that?
Wasn't very long, was it?
Well, let's take a look and see. I'm not going to tell you because I'm the one asking the question.
Well, it went from the first month to 12.
Okay, so that would be 11 months. So actually, a fairly long time. Now, why would it need to be a fairly long time?
Pretty big kingdom.
Pretty big kingdom. You got to make sure it gets out to everybody for one thing. It would not be surprising for the edict to take several weeks to perhaps even a month or more to reach the furthest edges of the kingdom. And once it gets there, there's the possibility that somebody might have questions, and they may send messengers back. I mean, we see at the very end of it, it says that the city is in confusion because of this command. I can imagine some of the regional governors going, wait a minute, we were supposed to wipe out an entire race of people. We have questions about this, Now, the king is the monarch, he's an absolute monarch, so on one level, maybe there aren't any questions. We've been told to do this, we're going to do it because it's what we're supposed to do. But there may have been questions as well. So you need enough time, plus this is a big process, gathering together the forces and everything that needs to be done. This is all part of this process. And so 11 months is given for this from the time that the decree is issued until the point at which it's supposed to actually take place. And that's important also from the standpoint of our heroes, because our heroes need time to come up with a response or with a course of action as well. So it actually is a fairly lengthy time frame as well as a fairly complex process, and it goes out to everybody. It's read in their languages. It's read throughout the empire. What's interesting though is at the end it says that the king and Haman sat down to drink, which suggests that to them it's no big deal. From the king's perspective, he's not even paying attention to it, and from Haman's perspective, he's set in motion the plans, and so he doesn't need to worry about it. And so they're taking their ease, but the rest of the city is in confusion, which suggests what? Why would they be in confusion?
Well, they kind of just got a decree out of the blue that all Jews were to be annihilated.
Okay.
That would kind of confuse me.
It's not every day, you get a command that says we're going to wipe out a whole group of people.
Yeah.
I mean, even Hitler had to sort of work up to that. He didn't just start right off with we're going to kill all the Jews. He kind of blamed them for some things, and then he isolated them or started doing encouraging acts of violence against them and isolating them, and then sending them off to camps and then killing them. I mean, there was a process. This is just from 0 to 100 miles an hour overnight, basically, or in the middle of the day, as it turns out. And so, understandably, there's confusion, and it's likely that many of the people in the city of Susa know Jewish people. Mordecai himself appears to be somewhat prominent, but there's others that they surely do know, and this has got to be somewhat shocking to most of them.
That's a silly question, but how many Jews were in the city at that time?
We have no idea. No way to know. We have some, I mean, there's probably some guesstimates about how many Jews were in the Persian Empire during this period of time, and it would probably be in the several 100,000 range.
So a bunch of them.
Yeah, there's a bunch of them in the empire. Within Susa itself, maybe I misunderstood your question. Within Susa itself, we have no way to know.
Right.
But within the empire as a whole, we have just a general sense.
So it wasn't like there was a handful of Jews throughout the empire that needed to be destroyed. There was a bunch of them.
And they would likely have been in communities for the most part. Now, so in some cases, like Mordecai, perhaps not, although the fact that I think there's something in this story that suggests that he's part of at least a small community. But in general, historically, Jews have tended to form communities within whatever environment they find themselves. And there are exceptions like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but most of them tend to be in communities within the larger community, which is part of the reason why they tend to be distinctive. Jews tend to be distinctive within the communities that they're in, partly because of how they dress and worship and things like that, but also because they don't keep to themselves exactly, but they have a very distinctive community mindset. And by this time, they probably would have created kind of proto-synagogues and some of those kinds of things. And so it would probably be easy, number one, for the people in most provinces where there were any significant number of Jews to identify them, but they would also be thinking, why are we going to be killing all these people? They're not problems, you know, they go about their business, they do their stuff, they don't cause rebellions. The Jews, before they were taken into captivity, were a lot of a hassle for the Assyrians and later the Babylonians. But once they went into captivity, they appear to have taken the advice of the prophets who basically said, go be good citizens and live your lives, and I'll bring you back when it's time. And they seem to have bought into that. And so for the most part, Jews were very good citizens. And so it would have been very shocking to the people to suddenly find out that they're supposed to kill them. So, Mark, did you
I was
want
gonna say, I wonder how many of them were their servants, you know what I mean? and
Could be that
slaves
too.
still, Because here these people are helping them or working for them,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden, hey, you're gonna wipe them all out? Wait a second here, you know?
Yeah.
Who's gonna do a lot of our stuff here for us?
Well, and that's true, and certainly by this time they also probably were shopkeepers and businessmen and people who were just part of the normal society. And you know, it'd be kind of like finding out that you were supposed to take out all of your, you know, to take out all the people that, you know, happen to work at the grocery stores and the, you know, fast food places. Not all of them, but just ones you used to being around and just doing a good job. You know, it's a very it's interesting to contrast the casualness with which Haman and the king are treating this and the response of the average person. And here again, I think with Haman, we understand. Haman is evil, and he wants to do an evil thing. With the king, it's less understandable in a way. There's this casualness to it that we don't see even in most modern leaders and rulers today, although we do see it in some. I mean, we don't have to go back to somebody like Hitler or Stalin to find somebody like that. We can look much more recently at, you know, we could make an argument with somebody like Putin, that his behaviors is that kind of casualness to it. And there's been other leaders in the last 20 or 30 years who had that same kind of mindset. I forget the guy's name, who was in Slobodan Milosevic, who was in Czechoslovakia, who basically wanted to wipe out an entire ethnic group, you know. So it's not unheard of, but for the average person to get a sudden instruction like this, it's definitely weird and unexpected. So, okay, so now we know the villain, now we know the villain's plan, and so the question then is, what are our heroes going to do about it? So can I get somebody to read for me chapter 4, verse 1 through 3, please?
When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes. He went out into the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. He went as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in each and every province where the command and decree of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay on sackcloths and ashes.
Okay, so, anybody ever worn sackcloth? Anybody ever seen sackcloth?
It's rough.
It is. It's rough and unpleasant. You don't want to wear it if you don't have to, or you know, I guess you feel like you're compelled to. It's definitely a sign that something is wrong. And the ashes aspect of it is, I mean, literally they would throw ashes up into the air and let it fall on them, so it made them look gray, and there's an obvious sign of mourning associated with this. And so Mordecai begins to do this. He begins to wail, and loudly and bitterly it says. He goes up to the king's gate. It's interesting. You wonder, did he not know he was allowed to go in, or was he just planning to go that far and no farther? Gets out to the king's gate and he can't go in because he's wearing sackcloth. Why would the king not want sackcloth being worn inside the king's palace?
Palace seems like a fancy place. There might be a dress code.
Okay, so it could just be a dress code violation. You are not dressed appropriately to come into the king's palace. Underlying that, though, I think there might be something else.
I would say that the king probably didn't want people demonstrating in his palace, and so this would be a demonstration.
Okay, so it could be, the sort of thing is, a president doesn't want, somebody who's protesting to come inside with their signs and start making noise inside the White House. They can do it out in front if they have to, but they can't come inside. I wonder if the other aspect of this, because it's interesting because it says no one is wearing sackcloth. Wearing sackcloth was not just a Jewish demonstration of mourning. This was a Middle Eastern custom and methodology. So what I'm wondering is if maybe it's just that the king doesn't like to have sad people around him. And we actually see, sorry, go ahead, I'll do what you say and then I'll have my thoughts, so go ahead.
This is just kind of funny. Sarah says, could be a Jewish custom, not a Persian one.
What's that?
The sackcloth and
Oh.
ashes.
Tell her she's not in our class.
Yeah. Just got the text.
It may not have been Persian, but it's definitely been a Middle Eastern custom. It's broader than the Arabic world does it as well. What's interesting is if you look in, I believe it's Nehemiah, it's either Nehemiah or Ezra, that it's Nehemiah because he serves as the cupbearer to the king, and a different king, but one of the Persian kings. Nehemiah, early on in his book, finds out that Jerusalem is still a disaster area, even though the Jews have gone back sometime before. When he goes in to serve his wine, the king his wine, the king takes one look at him and says, "What's wrong with you? Nobody looks like that hasn't heard really bad news." And Nehemiah, for a second, is terrified because you're not supposed to be depressed in front of the king. Now, he actually says he throws up a Hail Mary prayer and then proceeds to tell the king what he's concerned about, and the king is moved by God to send him to help with the reconstruction and everything. My point is, it's possible that what's going on here is that the king has said, you don't come into my presence looking sad and mourning and those kinds of things unless I tell you to. You don't look like that, you don't behave like that. I want people around me that are happy because I'm the king and I expect good things. And I mean, look at all the other things this guy does to make himself happy. To me, this is entirely possible. I'm not saying it's necessarily the case, I'm just saying it wouldn't surprise me if this is a function of we don't look sad around the king kind of a thing. You dress nice, you look like you're having a good time, and you bring positive energy into the palace, I guess, or something like that. So anyway, either way, whatever the reason is, he can't get inside. And then it goes on to say that everywhere where the command and decree came, which was everywhere, there's great mourning among the Jews. And notice one of the things, they're weeping and wailing. These are the same things that Mordecai's doing. What's the other thing that they're doing? They're fasting. Okay, so why are they fasting? I mean, it doesn't help to not eat. If you're going to die anyway, you might as well, eat, I guess.
It would be a plea to God.
Okay, so it doesn't talk specifically about prayer in this particular context. It will later on. But fasting is one of the things that in the Old Testament, the Jews are called on to do when they want to get God's attention, basically. That's a little bit of a modernization of that concept. But essentially what it speaks about is, if you're mourning, if you want to lift up, prayers or concerns, fasting is a part of that process. And so it is almost certain that what's happening here is that this is the Jews beginning to call on God for some kind of rescue, some kind of help in their distress here, because they certainly don't have any other options. The king, who's been their defender in the past, is no longer on their side. They don't have the capacity to defend themselves against this, not in any meaningful way, and so this is a very bad situation for them. So, okay, somebody read for me verses, 4 through 8, the next paragraph, basically.
Then Esther's maidens and her eunuchs came and told her, and the queen writhed in great anguish, and she sent garments to clothe Mordecai, that he might remove his sackcloth from him, but he did not accept it. Then Esther summoned Hathach from the king's eunuchs, whom the king had appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. So Hathach went to Mordecai to the city square in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict, which had been issued in Susa for their destruction, and he might show Esther and inform her to order her to go to the king to implore his favor and to plead with him for her people.
Okay. So, and again, I've said this before, this, more than any other book in the Old Testament, at least, and probably in the New Testament as well, is constructed as a literary work. This is a deliberately told story that's set up in a very deliberate way. The action develops in a very specific kind of a way, and there's a process to it. So Esther's maidens and her eunuchs, so she's got people attending her in the palace because she's the queen after all. They came and told her. What did they come and tell her? From the context, what did they actually come and tell her?
Mordecai was out there in sackcloth,
Okay.
wailing and doing all, but apparently they didn't tell him why he was doing it.
Okay. So, and that's a really good point. So when the first time I read this, I thought, well, they came and told her that, you know, that he was wailing because the Jews were all going to get exterminated. And then you read a little further, and it's not until she sends her eunuch out that it's communicated to her the reasons why he's doing it. So initially, at least, Esther's reaction when it says she writhes in great anguish, it's not because of the specific threat to the Jewish people. It's because something is upsetting her uncle, or rather her cousin, who she views as a father figure. So something has happened that's so bad that she is sympathetic to him, regardless of what it actually is. She doesn't even know the details at that point. And what does she try to do to fix the problem initially?
Clothes.
That's right. So you wonder what she might have thought the problem was. Maybe she thought he'd had sort of a reversal of fortune and lost all of his money or something like that, and so she's trying to help out. It's kind of interesting that's her response is, here's some clothes, dude, hopefully but he won't take them because the point isn't that he's lost his business. The point is that he's got a much bigger problem that he's weeping about.
Well, and Ryan, it seems to me too that I don't understand the sackcloth and ashes things, but it doesn't seem like they did that for just woke up on the wrong side of the bed this morning, might as well do the sackcloth and ashes, right? So it seems like she was deeply anguished because this guy's out in the city gate.
Yeah. Yeah, if you know that the places, the situations in which the Jews are commanded to do sackcloth and ashes, it's when there's been a massive, a major sin against God, or there's a major crisis like Jehoshaphat has the people do that, Hezekiah has the people do that when Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, comes up against Jerusalem. He has them dressed like that. And so it's situations where there's a huge crisis, either spiritually or physically, when that happens. And so she would have presumably understood enough to understand that there was some kind of huge crisis in Mordecai's life, but not necessarily have any really idea of how broad the crisis really was. And so that's what her chief eunuch ends up finding out for this. Hadak, or whatever his name is. She sends him out to Mordecai, and Mordecai explains the situation to him, gives him a copy of the decree, which is interesting because that means that either he's prominent enough to be able to get a hold of one, or they're basically just handing them out to people. Either way, he's able to get a hold of one. He gives them a copy, he tells them how much money Haman's promised to pay, all of this, so that Esther can understand what's going on, because what does he want her to do?
Go plead with the king.
Okay, go plead with the king for her people. And in fact, what it says is, he actually tells the eunuch to order her to go do that. Now, not by the eunuch's authority, by Mordecai's authority. I kind of wonder if the eunuch actually put it that way. You are hereby ordered, to go to the queen. No, I don't think so. I suspect the eunuch may have tried to sort of soften it a little bit, but nevertheless, so now Esther has the full information about this. Okay, so somebody read for me verses 9 through 12.
And Hatak went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hatak and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. How far?
Just stop there for the moment. So, thank you. So, all right, so Esther's response back to Mordecai is, I haven't, you know, the problem is, basically what she's saying is, so the problem is that there's a rule, and the rule says I can't go in front of the king, nobody can go in front of the king unless they've been summoned, or on pain of death, basically. And as we'll see in a little bit, there is a way to get around that, but the basic rule is if you haven't been summoned, you don't get to come in front of the king. Let's see. Yeah, and so the way around that is that the king holds out the golden scepter, and then you're okay to be there. Now, does anybody see any sort of functional problems with a rule like that?
It'd be awful hard to get a message to the guy.
I know, right? So like, the kingdom's being invaded, off with his head. You know, it's like, well, wait a minute. You know, it seems like that's not a really practical rule to have when you're in charge of an entire kingdom and you might need to know stuff. You know, if you just don't happen to summon the right guy for 30 days or so, who knows how much of your kingdom might get swallowed up by the Romans or whatever before you find, or the Greeks, I guess, in their case, before you finally find out what's going on because everybody's afraid to come into your presence. Where does a rule like this come from? What kind of thought process generates a rule like this?
I can imagine the king would view it as a tremendous disrespect.
Okay. So there's a respect element of it.
I could see it as an annoyance, right?
Okay.
The king is in the lap of luxury. He doesn't want to have to do anything. He's delegating the work to the workers.
Okay.
So he's in there lounging on his golden pillows or whatever, and doesn't want to be bothered.
Okay. So we could be, and that would, I mean, there's a degree to which I've kind of brought out sort of a particularly negative potential portrayal of the king, and that would be right in line with that. That you've got this guy who's just, you know, kind of a dilettante. He makes some decisions when he has to because it's a public kind of a thing. The rest of the time, he doesn't really want to be bothered. And when he does make decisions, he doesn't necessarily make very good ones unless he's got advisors helping him out with it. And so he just doesn't want people coming into his presence because he's left the jobs to other people. That would be kind of, I think, probably the most negative way to view this. And I don't know that that's fair or not fair. In the middle of that kind of is the idea that perhaps, you know, there is an issue of respect and there is an issue of not so much annoyance as the possibility that when people feel free to come in with everything, they're going to bring you little problems and little things that you don't need to be doing. And so there's a degree to which this could be sort of incentivizing people to take charge and to be responsible for things, particularly if there's a certain amount of grace, might be too strong a word, but if you have a certain amount of leeway for people to make mistakes. Historically, that's not been true among a lot of dictatorial types, but the king of Persia was an unusual kingdom in terms of how it was operated, so it is entirely possible that he did delegate a lot of authority and gave a certain amount of leeway with people to get it wrong sometimes, as long as they were doing their best or trying or whatever. So it's hard to say for sure exactly what's going on with this, but like I said, to me it seems like a very problematic principle if it's that absolute, that if you come into my presence and I don't want you there and I don't extend the scepter to you, you're going to be killed. It creates a situation where you may be staving off irritations or annoyances or people who are overly solicitous, but on the other hand, it seems like you're risking the possibility of missing out on some really important information. Now, in our modern environment, we have people who have tremendous authority, the president, for example. Who takes care of sort of being the I guess the bouncer, for lack of a better word, for the president? Anybody know who does that?
Secret Service.
Well,
You said bouncer.
that's true. I don't mean so much the ones that keep the armed people away from it. I'm talking about the guy whose job it is to make sure that you're going to come see the president, you need to have something important to say. I should have said it. Chief of Staff, exactly. Okay, so the president has a chief of staff, and one of the chief of staff's primary jobs is to make sure that the president is not bothered with things that the president doesn't need to decide. That if it's something that can be decided by one of his cabinet or by one of the staffers in the White House, that can be done that way, and the president only deals with the things that have to be dealt with by the president, because there's plenty of stuff for the president to do. And that may be a similar situation here, but this response is overkill in my mind to that kind of a situation. In Esther's case, though, well, more broadly for what it does for us in terms of from a literary standpoint is it creates this big kind of, problem, this challenge to be overcome, which is a classic device in literature for when you have a hero. The hero has to overcome more than one obstacle to actually get to what they want to do. And it requires bravery and sacrifice and things like that. And so Esther is presented with a situation where she knows that she needs to do something, but there is a danger to her in doing that thing, in that it exposes her to the possibility of execution if the king doesn't respond to her positively. So then somebody read for me verses 13 through, I guess it's just 13 through 14. Esther said to Mordecai, I'm a little worried. What does Mordecai say back?
Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you, in the king's palace, can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this.
Okay. So there's a lot in this paragraph to unpack. It's only 2 verses long, but Mordecai says a bunch of different things that are kind of critical for us. So the first thing he says is, don't imagine that you're safe just because you're in the king's palace. In the sense of that she's not under the threat of what is being threatened against the Jews. Now, is she genuinely under threat of what's been promised or what's going to happen to the Jews? Is that a legitimate threat against her personally? Maybe. On the face of it, it is. Now, it seems unlikely that if the king is notified as to who she actually, that this has been done, that if he loves her, that he's going to let that happen. But on the face of it, at least she is, and certainly what Mordecai's reference to her family, they're certainly under threat of it because they are Jews and they are not currently under the protection of the king. So she's under threat of what's being said there. But Mordecai says something really interesting, because what he really says basically is, when you come right down to it, this whole situation is not going to turn out to the destruction of the Jews, because why?
God's going to deliver them.
Okay, one way or the other, God's going to deliver us, because God made us promises. God made us promises when we were taken into captivity that He would eventually, that if we were obedient and if we blended in and ran our lives and were obedient to Him, that we would eventually find a restoration. So we can't possibly all get wiped out. Now He doesn't articulate all of that, but that's the truth. It's kind of like the argument I made with Abraham. When Abraham is after he's been called to Canaan, and he's traveling around with Sarah, and there's a famine, and they go down to, I believe the first time they do it, they go to Egypt. No, Philistia is the one I'm thinking of. To Philistia, where the king of the Philistines, he tells Sarah to lie and tell everybody that she's his sister because he's afraid the Philistines will kill him. But he's already at that point been promised that he is going to have a son. So strictly speaking, he is the most unkillable person in the world, because until he has a son, he can't possibly die. And so what does he have to be afraid of? And that's kind of what Mordecai's argument is here. Basically is, we have promises that say we have to still be around, so somehow or the other there's going to be deliverance. Whether it's by your hand and you doing what you're supposed to do, or whether it's something else. So why then does he go on to say, but if you don't do what you're supposed to do and deliverance comes some other way, you and your father's family will perish? What's the logic or what's his thinking behind that argument, other than just maybe trying to freak his cousin out?
I guess that's up for speculation.
Okay.
If deliverance comes another way, the deliverance could involve the destruction of the royal court.
That could be. That's an interesting idea. Yeah. Okay. So one possibility would be sort of an overreaction by God. We'll solve this once and for all, and just wipe that pesky king off the map, sort of a thing. And who knows what else will get taken along with it. So, okay, that's a possibility. To me, the implication that he's making here is that if she doesn't step up and do what Mordecai clearly believes that God wants her to do, then God is going to probably take action against it. There's going to be some sort of judgment, and because of the association that we see in the Old Testament of the sins of fathers and families following families as a whole, that her family will suffer as a result of that. And to me, that's the most likely thing. Now, his argument is not, this is one area where his argument is not particularly well fleshed out. I mean, that's just the reality. He makes a threat, basically, that does not appear to have a clear basis in why he thinks it will be true. But to a significant extent, he's speculating anyway, because he basically says deliverance is going to come from somewhere else. Now, he's not saying I know where it's going to come from, other than it's going to be from God, but he's not saying I know what's going to cause it. And by the same token, he's not saying I know exactly what's going to happen to you and your family, but it seems that what he's saying is that God's going to make something bad happen. God's going to make something happen that's going to deliver the Jews, and God's going to make something bad happen because you didn't do what you were in position to do. And so then he makes a final argument, and in some ways this argument flows through everything he said up to this point, but in another way it's kind of a separate argument on top of that. And his final argument is, and who knows whether you have not obtained royalty for such a time as this. That what he's saying is, and again, he's not saying I know for sure. That's kind of an interesting point. He says, I don't know for sure, but maybe the reason that you're the queen is because God wants you there in order to help with this, to step up and be the one who is the voice of your people in this situation. And so that, there again, that ties into the idea of God having an expectation for her. But in a way, his argument is he's almost saying, it doesn't even matter whether that's the reason why or not. This is where we are right now. You are in a position to do this, and just like other people who were called on to do things when they were in the position to do them, whether it was David or the judges or the different kings or the different heroes that we find in the Old Testament, those people stepped up and did what they were supposed to do. Sometimes we know they got there on purpose. People like Joseph, we know they were put there on purpose. Other times we don't know. And it doesn't matter. His argument basically is it doesn't matter whether you were put there on purpose or whether you just happened to be there. You have an obligation because you're there to do what God's people need you to do. So this basic principle, this underlying idea of as for such a time as this, is one that we see coming out in our modern Christian culture. People talking about this idea of being in the right place at the right time, that's not a coincidence necessarily. Now, I don't believe in coincidence exactly, but I don't necessarily believe that every single thing we encounter in our lives is God having deliberately planned out every minute of every second of our day. But certainly when we are given, blessings and we are provided with opportunities, even if there's not a specific idea of this is exactly what you need to do, there is an expectation that as Christians we will take advantage of those opportunities. And ultimately Esther is about that principle more than anything else. All right, any last comments? We need to take a break and we'll pick up with Esther's response and then how she deals with the situation after that. Okay, let's take a break. We'll get back together at 10:30 and get started on worship.